Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teach, the channel where we talk about all things teaching. My name is Zander. I am an online ESL teacher as well as an entrepreneur, and we are passionate about training new teachers to step into the world of online English teaching. And so, if you're watching this, I want to thank you very much. I assume that most people that normally watch the show will probably be teaching right now, which is what I like to hear. But for those watching the recording, thanks so much for taking the time to have a look at this. If you want to reach out to us, feel free to visit our website www.etefonline.co.za, or you're welcome to send me an email at zander at etefonline.com. So for the past few weeks, we've sort of done a series of interviews with key role players within the world of online English teaching. We've interviewed some teachers that recently launched their careers as online teachers. We've also spoken to some veteran teachers that's been doing this for quite some time, and we've shared with you both the good and the bad of the world of online teaching. And if you haven't watched the interviews, you're welcome to go to the YouTube channel, click on live. You'll be able to watch all of the interviews on there. Last week specifically was quite an interesting one that we had when we spoke to Ruan, who is a tax practitioner within the South African context. And so he spoke to us a little bit about how the South African Revenue Service views us as online teachers, how to sort of position yourself well to make sure that you pay as little tax as possible. And so for all that South African teachers, if you missed that session, feel free to go to the YouTube channel, click on live, and you'd be able to view that session as well. So today's session is one that I'm equally excited and intimidated by, because I think this is a topic that I get asked about quite a lot, especially with new teachers transitioning into online teaching. Generally, when they start out after about 2 or 3 months, they start to sort of face some challenges in terms of the methods that they use for teaching, the materials. And so I tend to get questions quite a lot in terms of, how do I know if I'm doing a good job? How do I know if my student is actually improving in their fluency? How do I know if I'm using the right materials? Am I giving enough feedback? So those are all all topics that we will be discussing today. And I'm very excited to introduce my guest to you. Now, I'm not going to speak a lot about his resume. I would like him to do it himself, because I'm afraid that I might mess it up. But basically, our guest today is actually responsible for creating the TEFL course, the accredited course that we offer at eTEF Online. And so we'll also briefly touch on that in today's session. But without further ado, I want to welcome Daniel into our session. Daniel, how are you today?
Doing great. It's sort of a rainy morning here in Modi'in, Israel, but doing okay despite the weather.
Great. That's good to hear. Thanks so much once again for taking the time to join us today and have this discussion. I can't think of anyone else that's more qualified than you to help us as online teachers to navigate our way through helping our students become more fluent using the English language. So before we get into the topic of today, Daniel, would you mind maybe taking a minute or two and giving us a bit of your background?
Sure. So I kind of never meant to be an English teacher. It just sort of happened. What happened was that actually I studied my bachelor's degree. I studied Japanese, and I was in Japan. And at the time, just about anybody who claimed to be an English speaker could be an English teacher, and you made some really good money. And so I wasn't going to miss that opportunity. But what actually happened was that I really fell in love with English teaching. I loved the energy. I loved the improvement in terms of my students, et cetera. And it was really nice. Later on, I did a TEFL certificate. And from there, I became more interested in the sort of the back office, the language, the linguistics, et cetera, and continued my studies from there.
Excellent. Well, I think you and I should have a private conversation as well, because I'm flying to Japan in about 4 weeks. So yeah, I'm terrified and excited at the same time. But yeah, it's really, really cool. So you obviously were responsible for creating our the TEFL course that we use at eTEF Online. How did that happen?
Yeah, so this was actually during COVID when a lot of us were kind of at home thinking of things to do, how to occupy our time, etc. Jody and I had met through a mutual friend, and Jody was building up eTEFL at that point, and had sort of a basic skeleton course. It's actually probably much of the same skeleton that we see now. And he said, let's make this a really good course. Let's make this a top class course. Would you like to partner? Would you like to do it? And I, by that time, I'd had some experience in teacher training here in Israel in the Ministry of Education, and felt that I was well positioned for that. So I said, yeah, let's go for it. Let's see what we can do. And so I spent quite a long time during COVID putting this course together and hopefully making it as useful as possible.
Yeah, and it is excellent. I mean, the feedback that we've gotten from teachers is that it's a really, really good course, so really well done. With that, you are currently lecturing in Israel, right?
That's correct. That's correct. I wear a few hats, probably like so many other teachers. I do teach in academics. I teach future engineers at an engineering college. Communication skills for engineers, cross-cultural communication, presentations. But I also teach in the industry, mostly online, engineers who are actually practicing, and people from other professions as well. So I kind of see what my students are going to need in a few years, and that's very exciting to be able to kind of bring that into those courses as well.
And the audience or the students you mostly teach, are they locals from Israel or all over the world?
They are locals from Israel. That's
Okay.
that's basically what I have done most of my career. I did have a stint teaching young folks from China, which I enjoyed very, very much at the time. But most of my audience is Israeli.
Okay, great. Excellent. That's really, really cool. So let's dive into the topic a little bit. So, broadly speaking, what would you say in your experience, specifically with teaching English as a second language or as a foreign language? What would you say are some of the essential building blocks for someone both teaching and learning a foreign language?
Okay, so the expected answer is always grammar, vocabulary, maybe pronunciation, and that sort of thing. I won't deny that those aren't building blocks, but I think that sometimes we miss an essential building block, which is the whole text. And I think that as early as possible, we should be introducing our students to entire text. And I don't mean an academic article. And when I say text, it can be a simple conversation. It can be a commercial. It can be many, many different things. And what I also mean is not necessarily written text, because I really feel that when we can contextualize what we're teaching within a text, students are able to connect to it better, and then the grammar and vocabulary naturally become relevant, and then from there to build up. That's what I've discovered over the years.
Yeah, almost reverse engineering the process. Instead of starting with grammar structures and vocabulary, we actually present them with something that's, how can we say, like applied English, almost in the form of an article or a commercial or a video or interview or something. And then we make that our main focus. And then if there are some grammar structures that the student doesn't understand, we almost work back and go, okay, let's focus for a moment on the technical side of this and take it from there.
Absolutely. And we can actually, with AI today, we can actually build such texts today. We can emphasize a certain grammar point if we want, or emphasize certain vocabulary if we want. So that's okay to have that agenda if we want to have an agenda. But I do think that once students see these things in context, it's probably easier to grasp than isolated grammar points.
For sure. And what I found a lot of times with especially adult students is they've gone through school and university. They don't want that sort of very formal academic environment necessarily. And so they want it more sort of conversation focused, or just a lot less formal than the kind of education they've been exposed to prior to that for many years. So You touched on the point of AI, so I want to ask the question here. If you want to give us some breaking news, are you working on an AI course for online teachers or not yet?
Well, actually, Jody has asked me to put something together, maybe a short webinar, because I had just off the cuff, I just mentioned that I am tutoring someone. I'm actually tutoring a young person right now who's very interested in various things. He likes mobile phones. He likes the solar system. He likes, I'm trying to think what else we've done. Oh, gaming, etc. And with AI, it's so easy to make up such customized lessons. And that is something that I would like to do, at least to have a taster of that, because I do
For
think
sure.
it's something that can supercharge our practices.
Excellent. Well, please keep us posted on when that happens. I'm sure there are a lot of teachers that would like to join. So, um, something that I want to ask you in terms of your approach, right? So, I guess when we speak about online teaching, and especially the approach that we take at eTEFL Online, is that we've identified that sort of the trend seems to be that people find work opportunities much quicker with online schools compared to freelance platforms. So we generally take the strategy of helping them to find employment with online schools while they're waiting for their freelance profiles to sort of build some momentum. And the benefit of that, in my opinion, is that schools, generally speaking, provide you with all the material. So it's sort of, you don't have to put much thought into what's the starting point for the student and where do I want to get them. You just get assigned a student with the material, you teach the material. When the lesson is done, you don't have to think about that student anymore. You might have them again in the future, but again, the school is doing all of that work for you. Whereas with freelance platforms, it's basically all on you. It's much more of a free environment. So a question I have for you, and I actually had a conversation with someone yesterday that did our mentorship program in January, and she actually did it for some reason the other way around. She got, like, I think her profile on freelance platform became active on a Saturday and she had a trial lesson on a Sunday. So she never had the experience of actually teaching with a school where they provide the material. So her challenge right now is, where do I even start? So in your opinion, when you let's say you get booked with an adult student, let's say they indicate on their profile they're a B1, but you have nothing else to work from. What would be a starting point for you, let's say, in lesson number 1? Where would you start?
Right. So what I often do is ask them some questions to prepare for the first lesson. Once we've decided that, we're going to have a lesson, I say, okay, I'd like you to prepare a self-intro, starting with, your education's relevant to your career, what you're doing, where you see yourself going. And then the second question is always, what role does English play in your professional or personal life? And what would you like to improve? And this is often a conversation that we have the first lesson. And then from there, not only am I able to really ascertain their real level, whether it's B1 or B2, et cetera, but I'm also able to understand exactly what it is they want to do. I also get companies that sometimes say, so-and-so needs these kinds of skills. And then I find out within the lessons that they probably need something else. Yeah. And so it's a really good subject of a first lesson to discuss these things. I provide feedback in terms of vocabulary and grammatical structures and things like that. So, there's learning and there's advancement within that first lesson. But from there, then I get a really good, clear picture and then can make up my plan.
Yeah. And you mentioned the point of actually providing them with feedback. How do you do that? Because something that sort of a conversation I've had with myself many times is, you have some students that would tell you, please interrupt me every time I make a mistake. And then, especially for lower level students, like in my mind, I've built this thing where I go, if you're an A2 and you're asking me to interrupt you every single time you make a mistake, you're gonna be so exhausted out after that lesson. The conversation won't be able to flow. What would you say, like, what's your approach, let's say, with lower level and more advanced students in specifically correction, and doing it immediately or delaying it for a later stage?
Right. So I would say that my approach is more a delayed approach. I'm constantly taking notes
Yes.
as I'm teaching. In fact, I have two screens. I have one screen above the screen that we're talking
Yeah.
on right now, and I usually have a Google Doc open, and I'm constantly writing things down, thinking about what I'd like to come back to. In fact, many times I tell my students, if I look up, it's not because I'm thinking, "Oh God, Lord, what are you saying?" No, it's not that. It's because I'm just taking notes, and they get used to this kind of motion. And what I do as I'm sort of forming a picture of what's going on, I will pick, two things, maybe three, that I will address during the lesson, and say these are the things that I want to concentrate on now. I've taken some notes. I know that we have some other things we're going to talk about later, but I don't want to overwhelm the student.
Yeah.
And then we might make a deal. I might say, you know what, every time I do hear, this particular thing, I am going to stop you from now on because we've spoken about it, and it's
Love.
something I do want to, to kind of change in terms of behavior. There are those who from the first lesson say, stop me every single time. And I say, let's negotiate that. Exactly what you're saying, because we won't, the person will become gun shy, and the fluency will be compromised.
Yeah. I absolutely love what you said about we have to have a conversation about issues first before I will interrupt you on, because if you make the mistake, and we've not spoken about that, I can understand why you're doing it. But once we've spoken about it, it's almost like you don't have a free pass anymore for that specific thing. And I think that's a really, really good approach. And that's also how I normally negotiate with my students. But let's say, for example, you're having a conversation with a student, you're taking your notes. How do you decide which ones to address first? Would you go grammar issues first instead of vocabulary, or how do you make that determination?
Okay, so vocabulary for me, it's 100%, because at the end of the day, maybe I'll talk a bit about my methodology, but they get the Google Doc. In other words, this is a shared Google Doc, and any new vocabulary. When I finish my lesson, I actually send them a WhatsApp with the vocabulary, so they can listen to the vocabulary with the sample sentence, etc. So I think that building up vocabulary, that's something that can go 100% of the time. Grammar, I listen for patterns. I listen for repetition of things. I listen for something that might have just been a slip, but mainly what I'll do is if I hear something repeated, during a stretch of speech, that's probably something that I need to take care of first.
Yeah, for sure. I want to get your opinion on something that I've recently started trying. I'm not decided yet on if it's a good strategy or not, but it's basically, it came from a similar conversation I had with one of my adult students that asked me to correct them when they make a mistake. And so we had that negotiation to say, listen, I'm going to correct you on things that I've already given you feedback on and explained. But then we basically agreed on a system where for the first 10 minutes of our conversation, I'm going to correct you every single time, whether it's something we've spoken about or not. And then again, for the last 10 minutes of that conversation. And we've started seeing some sort of effects of that in the sense of a positive way. And it seems like they're appreciating that. What do you make of something like that? Even because when I was planning this, I was like, maybe I should have like a orange slide and then a red one and then a green one. And then I went on ChatGPT and I was like, do you think this is a good idea? And he's like, maybe the colors, it's not such a good idea. But what do you make of an approach like that?
I think anything that's negotiated with a student who's aware of their learning and they think is helpful is fine.
Yeah.
So, if that's something that works for you and the student, and they feel that that's helping, that's okay. With some students, it could cause anxiety because then they, but others, it might be fine. I've had students who say, the grammar doesn't really matter to me. I just want to get my message out. And then I've had to fine tune them a little bit towards some grammar, saying, look, some of this is going to cause misunderstandings. I've had students who've asked me about pronunciation or accent. They say, I don't want to sound like a Hebrew speaker. And I said, but you are a Hebrew speaker. And yeah. And, and the truth is that if I can understand you, and I think that someone who, maybe is not exposed to a Hebrew accent will be able to understand you in a business presentation, I'm not going to make those corrections. But then I have others who say, I insist on it. I want you to stop me when I make any pronunciation, uh, error or something like that. So I've had kind of extremes, and
Yeah.
I negotiate it with each student.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that conversation could eventually move into like a accent neutralizer, which is, I assume it's a very specialist field. And I've also had students where I would have a conversation with them, and we'd stop at a word, and they would ask me, "Is this the right pronunciation? How do you pronounce it?" And then I have to have the conversation to say, "Listen, some people will say fast, others will say fast. Both are correct."
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I don't want to take your accent away from you. If you're from Poland or Italy, you still have an accent, and that's a beautiful thing. And you can speak English correctly within that accent. And so that's sort of also a technical point that I've experienced many times, where I even would pronounce words differently from my student, and I need to convince them to say, yours is correct. It's not a pronunciation error. It's literally just your accent that's making it different. So yeah. Let's maybe talk a little bit about methods of teaching. We've briefly touched on it already. There are obviously many different approach: direct approach, functional approach, immersive approach. I think especially when working with students living in non-native speaking, English-speaking countries, it's always tough, because it's almost like every lesson is a little pocket of English, and then when they get up from there, they're back into their own world and language. For a student like that, that's basically surrounded with a language that's not English, and basically the only experience they have speaking English is in a lesson with you. What has been your experience with sort of adopting different approaches with those students?
Right. So yeah, that is something I do take into account, and therefore I do insist that students expose themselves to English in some way between lessons. So often what I will ask my students to do is to watch a podcast or read something, or even if it's something from their work that they could uh, maybe read in their L1 in their first language, but to go ahead and read it in English. And so there I know that English is sort of happening outside of the classroom as well, because once a week or twice a week or however many times these pockets of English are not going to do it. And
Yeah.
so that the responsibility in terms of those sorts of things is it's on them. And then unpacking it. So usually my one methodology I like, and this goes together with whole text, is okay, tell me about what you read, what you saw, etc. And then, of course, depending on their level, how much I have to help them to tell me about it. By the way, I will often ask them just to WhatsApp me, the file beforehand, so I can see, what it was, and then I can ask appropriate questions. I can guide them through. I can maybe help them in terms of misunderstandings of whatever it is they watched or they read, and then to ask their opinion about it. To ask them what vocabulary they saw in there that they think would be useful for themselves. So a lot of what I do is putting the responsibility on the learner, because my personal goal is, though I like my profession, and I like receiving money for my for my services, but my goal is for them to say, wow, Daniel put me on a really good track. I can actually also advance on my own. And I think that would be the biggest compliment as a teacher. And
100.
yeah, would of course, assist in building reputation, etc.
Yeah. And do you generally make a recommendation to these students, like how many hours a week is enough? Let's say they book 2 hours worth of lessons with you, and maybe you encourage them to listen to podcasts. What is your recommendation in terms of how many hours, but also frequency? Like, is it better to do 2 hours on one day, or is it better to do 10 minutes every day, or something like that?
Right. So in terms of time, I basically tell them if they book X with me, then I want another X on their own. So I get some very enthusiastic teachers. I want to study with, students. I want to study with you 2 hours a week, 3 hours a week, whatever. And I say, okay, if you have time to study 3 hours a week, 1.5 with me and 1.5 on your own. And
That's
that
cool.
sounds counterintuitive from a business point of view, but the results are much better, and
Yeah.
you'll have a long-term relationship, and you'll be recommended as someone who
Excellent.
lets who gets you gets you going, gets you progressing. Now a lot of people will tell me, well, yes, Saturday morning I spent 5 hours on English, and I do recommend. I say I think that the spacing would be better. I also say to
Yeah.
take shorter text. Don't listen to an hour and a half podcast. Listen to something even 10 to 15 minutes, but listen to it about
Yeah.
4 times throughout the week,
Yeah.
so that you understand
Yeah.
it better and better and better each time. And the traffic here in Israel is awful, so they have lots and lots of time on the road
Of course.
to listen to it again and again and again. And so I prefer even smaller tasks or shorter tasks, and even repeated throughout the week.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's I'm 100% on board, and this conversation is helping me a lot to sort of figure out which things I'm doing right and which I'm doing wrong, because I've always had this sort of theory that frequency is better than quantity, in a sense of I feel like or my theory used to be that if you get to expose yourself to English very frequently, I feel like your brain comes to the realization that he's asking me or she's asking me for this information really frequently. Maybe I should keep it on hand. And I had this experience, like this moment of revelation 2 years ago, where I did this with one of my students, and I encouraged him to be very frequent in terms of how often he exposed himself to English. And probably about 5 or 6 months into it, I received WhatsApp message the one day where he said, "I just had a thought in English."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh my goodness,
Yes.
that's incredible.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's something called linguistic priming, which basically, and I still remember from Linguistics 101 when the teacher said, if I say hospital, what are your next thoughts? Nurse, doctor, operation, medicine, etc. And so we know that if we prime ourselves and we listen to this text, then what's going to happen? It's going to prime other English. It's going to encourage other English to kind of enter our brains. And as you're saying, then I start thinking in English as well. These thoughts come up as well. So
Exactly.
it definitely helps.
English begets English.
Absolutely.
Great. We've got about three minutes left, Daniel. I've got two more questions that I want to ask you. Obviously, I'm not sure if this was the case pre-COVID, you would know better, but I definitely know since COVID, there have been thousands of people making the transition into online teaching, because it's a career where even your professional background, whether in corporate or sales or whatever, could in some way, shape, or form be relevant to you as an online teacher. But that means we've got a lot of, and I mean this with a lot of respect, but inexperienced teachers coming into the world of online ESL teaching. What do you make of this trend? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Will it eventually fade away? What do you think?
Oh, I don't think it's going to fade away. I think we're going to need more and more English. I do think there's going to be a shift to spoken communication, to helping to socialize people into how an English speaker might express themselves, maybe in terms of cross-cultural issues, in terms of being diplomatic in English, if you come from a more direct culture like where I live. And so I do think that that's going to be this sort of soft skill of English and communication skills, actually, I think is probably where we're going to see ourselves going. I foresee less tutorials in terms of, how do I write an email? How do I write a text? I think that as people get better with AI, that's going to help them. But then we're going to need to be able to judge whether that text that AI produced is really a good one. So I think that we're going to see that shift in terms of English teaching. And what I encourage people to do is to keep professionalizing, because I believe it's also going to be more specialized. I think people are going to be looking for the teacher that can help me do this, or the teacher that can help me do that, and not necessarily just one where, just teach me English. But people are going to be looking for specialists. And I think that what you're doing, Xander, is excellent in terms of helping to promote that.
Thank you very much. So what you're saying is niches are the future.
I think so.
That's really, really
and I think spoken English and spoken interaction is probably where we're going to have our relative advantage.
Yeah, For sure. So one final question, Daniel. Advice to teachers on how to better themselves, like how to upskill, how to maybe carve their niches, or just especially, let's say, for teachers that are in their first year of teaching. I remember for me, I probably had 5 moments of imposter syndrome in my first year, where which thankfully drove me to bettering myself and finding new ways of things. What could teachers do to improve their skill levels as teachers?
Right. So I think one of the things, and I also remember the imposter syndrome, and am I really a teacher, and do I understand, etc. Every time I had a question that I really didn't know, I really went and researched it. And then, I built that sort of knowledge base. And not only does it help the student, because, and there's no problem saying, you know what, that and which I really don't know what the difference is. And saying, I'm going to get back to you next time, or I'm going to email you or message you an answer for next time. And to research that kind of stuff and to make sure that you understand it. And I think also there are so many different groups out there, particularly Facebook groups of different teachers, trying to look at different niches of instruction. And I think that, that kind of professional development coming to, webinars like this, I think is super important. And, being on the lookout. I mean, I just did a series of ones having to do with AI, because I'm really into AI right now. So, even after nearly 26 years of teaching, I still regularly attend things that are out there. But I think that the infrastructure is probably joining the right Facebook groups, etc., so that you get to the right people who are the influencers and who are the experts in your in the field that you're interested in.
Yeah, for sure. And I love what you said about doing the research. I remember there were so many things that I didn't know. Like, I could hear when something is wrong, but I couldn't always explain why it's wrong. And so I did the same thing. I went ahead and researched, and I never had to research that topic ever again.
Right.
And you just mentioned that and which and what is something that I actually 2 months ago, this thing popped up and I was like, I know what the right one is, but now I understand relative pronouns. It's brilliant. So I feel so smart that because also as you start teaching, you notice that some mistakes are just universal. Like, most of your students will make those mistakes, and then it's helpful to have that arsenal of knowledge that you've researched to be able to give them an answer. I see Pepe here said, I do that and my students are quite comfortable with this. Brilliant. Yeah, don't be intimidated to say, listen, I don't know right now, but I'll definitely have an answer for you next time. Nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Daniel, thanks a lot. I really, really appreciate this. I could probably talk to you for another hour, but we don't have time for that today. And we're definitely looking forward to your AI webinar. Please keep us posted on when that's happening. And I encourage people, as Daniel said, attend more of these things, draw all the expertise and knowledge from experienced teachers out there to help you to be better. And then before we wrap it up, remember, next Monday afternoon, South African time, we'll continue with our series interviewing some people in this industry. With that said, thanks a lot, Daniel. Good luck with your day of lecturing and teaching and all the things you've got to do.
Thanks very much.
And have a great week.
You too.
Thank you.